In health, we have, particularly those that work at the clinical interface, some of the highest stress jobs in terms of professions in supporting other people. So incredibly important that we also look after ourselves and help to look after one another. And that's some of what you're going to hear about today. So, as we launch Mental Health Month, I can't think of a better way than having Dr. Sarah Edelman here to talk to us. And Sarah's going to give us some insight into the mind and provide us with strategies to manage stress. Exploring and changing the way we think can enable us to change the way we feel and behave. So a little bit about Sarah. Dr. Sarah Edelman is a clinical psychologist, author and trainer. Originally a high school teacher, she worked for 10 years as a research psychologist and lecturer at the University of Technology in Sydney. In addition to her private practice, Sarah conducts training programs for psychologists, general practitioners, business organisations and the general public. She is a consultant trainer for the Black Dog Institute in Sydney and runs public education programs at Sydney University Centre for Continuing Education. She is also a frequent guest on ABC 702 radio and has contributed many articles in professional journals and in the media. Her book, Change Your Thinking, is a bestseller. And I can certainly validate that. It's amazing how many people, when I've talked about the Mental Health Month and Sarah coming to talk to us, how many people have said, I have read Sarah's book, I am reading Sarah's book, what a great book it is. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Sarah Edelman.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Is that coming through? Yep. Yes, I'm delighted to be here and thank you for inviting me to come along today and talk a little bit about how our mind also contributes to a lot of our stress. We do know that all of us have stressful situations in our lives. We have lots of challenges and sometimes our situations are particularly difficult and stressful. But we also know that the way we respond and the way that we think about the situations that we find ourselves in plays a really important role in terms of our ability to cope with and manage those situations, and also how quickly we're able to bounce back when difficult situations arise. So in this morning's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about that cognitive component, that aspect of our thinking which can sometimes make our lives more difficult or easier depending on how we respond to those situations. The underlying philosophy that I'm going to be describing comes from cognitive behaviour therapy. Can I just say, show of hands if you're familiar with cognitive behaviour therapy or heard of it? Okay, terrific. So most people have heard of it. The philosophy of it's not getting any movement. Not able to move these slides. So we might need a little bit of technical assistance. It's still not moving. I might have to do it manually, which is a shame because I'm a little bit stuck. Okay, so the philosophy of CBT is not new. We know 600 BC, Buddha, one of the quotes from Buddha is, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts, and it's with our thoughts that we make our world." Epictetus, the Roman philosopher and Stoic, wrote, "It is never the things that happen to us that upset us, but the view that we take of those things." And finally, in Hamlet, in 1600 AD, "There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Who's familiar with that line in Hamlet? Some of you are familiar with it. And basically all of these ideas are focusing on the same principle, and that is the way that we think determines the way that we feel, or thoughts create feelings. And whether you feel angry or anxious or frustrated or sad or guilty or humiliated or miserable or furious, whatever it is that you're feeling, it is largely cognition, it is largely what's going on in our mind that creates those feelings. And that's a really important thing to understand, because that means that if we can change the way we think, we can actually change the way we feel. And that awareness means that we are able to learn to manage and modify, and in some cases avoid, upsetting emotions in all sorts of situations. I guess in a little bit more detail, this is the relationship. We have three pillars. And the first is cognitions. And cognition is thoughts, beliefs, underlying assumptions or perceptions, if you like. It's the meanings that we make of the situations that we find ourselves in. And the second is emotions, and we know that cognitions affect our emotions. And the third is behaviours. So behaviours are also central in all of this. But not only do cognitions affect emotions, emotions affect cognitions. So for example, when you feel anxious, the content of your thoughts are different to when you are not feeling anxious. So anxiety creates threat-focused thinking, or sometimes called catastrophic thoughts. So when we feel anxious, we are much more likely to have more anxious thoughts about all sorts of things. We're much more likely to have false alarms about things that might go wrong. When you feel sad, the content of your thoughts is more globally pessimistic. You have more thoughts about hopelessness. Your self-esteem tends to go down. You think more negatively about yourself. You think more negatively about the world. And when you feel angry, you have a lot more rumination and revenge fantasies and so on. Behaviours also play a really important role in this triangle, because the way that we behave has a direct effect on our emotions as well as our thoughts. So I guess we've all had the situation where we kind of feel sad and a bit miserable, and for whatever reason you end up making a phone call or going out and connecting with friends. And what happens when you go out and connect with friends or do something social? What happens to your emotion? You notice that it changes or it picks up. So we know that our behaviours can have a really strong effect on not only our emotions, but sometimes on our cognitions. So when you're feeling helpless because you feel depressed, changing your behaviours, so for example, putting on your walking shoes, going out for a walk and doing something which gives you a sense of achievement, or perhaps even cleaning out something or resolving an issue, can actually impact on your emotions as well as your cognitions, because your belief is, actually, I can make a difference. I do have some control over my world. So we know that there is quite a strong interrelationship between the way that we think, the way that we behave, and the way that we feel. And finally, just one other example is cognitions affecting behaviour. If your beliefs are, I'm not competent, or I'm not able to achieve the things that I want, how does that impact on your behaviours? Does it have an impact on your behaviours? In what sort of ways? You're less likely to try things, you're less likely to take risks, you're less likely to engage in things that are challenging because you don't believe that you're going to achieve those things. And if your beliefs are, people don't like me, how does that affect your behaviours? Does it affect your behaviours? Yeah, you tend to hang back socially. It might even affect things like eye contact. You don't take social risks. And interestingly, you're less likely to be warm and to reach out to people. So sometimes it can actually even be a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you feel bad about yourself, it actually affects the way you behave towards others. On the other hand, if you have a belief that most people like me, I'm a pretty likeable person and most people like me, how does that affect your behaviours? Does it have an effect on your behaviours? Tend to be warm, you tend to reach out to people, you tend to engage with people, you're not inhibited and self-conscious when you're actually dealing with people, because you just have this assumption that people like you. So these are just a couple of examples, but to illustrate the point that our thoughts impact not only on our emotions, but also on the way that we behave. And then the way that we behave will impact on our experiences, so it becomes a bit of an ongoing cycle. Just a few words, first of all, about emotions. Emotions are actually quite difficult to define. We all know, we've all experienced lots of emotions, we kind of all know what they feel like, but they're hard to define. And emotions have a really important role in terms of, in fact, they have evolutionary value. What is the role of emotions? Does anyone know why we have emotions? Emotions motivate behaviour. So they're important. They actually help us to survive. In evolutionary terms, they play a really important role. Fear, for example, we know has a really important role, both in evolutionary terms. If we think of our Stone Age ancestors, fear was absolutely essential in order to know when to run away or to protect themselves. But fear still has a role, an important role today, or anxiety has an important role today. We hate the feeling, most of us hate feeling anxious, but it has value at times. It can be adaptive. What is the value of anxiety at times? How does it motivate you? Can I see show of hands if you have been motivated by anxiety? Who's actually been motivated? In what way? What does it motivate you to do? If you're anxious about having to, I don't know, do a report or present something, how does it motivate you?
Just kind of university, being anxious helps you prepare better for exams and presentations.
Yeah, so it actually, that's right. So you prepare better, you actually go to a bit of extra trouble, or you're highly motivated to prepare if it's a job interview, or if it's a, you're dealing with a confronting or difficult client, you might think about how you're going to deal with it. Anger, can anger motivate you at times? Anger can actually have adaptive value. It can motivate you to stand up for your rights, to be assertive, to write a letter of complaint, sometimes to follow up with things because you have a strong sense of injustice. Can guilt motivate you at times? Okay, you're sitting at home, it's a beautiful day, the kids are sitting there watching TV, you're all playing on their computer, you're also sitting there watching TV. Does guilt have an adaptive value? It may be the thing that gets you to switch off the TV and motivate the kids to come out and go to the park or do something social. Most emotions have value at times. Where they become a problem is when we experience them too often, and when they last for a long period of time. So a short burst of anger is okay, a short burst of anxiety is okay, a short burst of sadness or guilt or whatever is okay, as long as it passes. And ideally, as long as it motivates adaptive behaviour, it motivates you to do things that ultimately are in your own best interests. Emotions can be pleasant or unpleasant, but interestingly, it is the unpleasant emotions which are by far the most beneficial in terms of motivating adaptive behaviour. So when we feel, and in fact, when you think about emotions, the range of pleasant emotions is much smaller than the range of unpleasant emotions. What are some of the pleasant emotions that we kind of look towards? Happy, yeah, kind of happy is probably the first one that most people think of. Contented. Anything else?
Joy.
Joy, which is kind of the same thing as happiness, more or less, or very close to. Would you agree with that? Peaceful, calm, contented. But you see, they're kind of similar, but to different degrees or different degrees of intensity. When you think about unpleasant emotions, there's a whole range of unpleasant emotions, and they will include what? Give me some examples. Anger, fear, frustration, resentment, guilt, shame, rage. What else? Sadness, depression, etc. In fact, we could brainstorm a whole list, and there'd probably be about 20 or 30 that we could come up with. And all of them can have adaptive value in certain situations. So the key questions to ask yourself when you're actually experiencing even unpleasant emotions is, are my emotions adaptive? In other words, do they actually get me the things that I want? Do they motivate me to do the things that I need to do? because unpleasant emotions can be helpful at times. So I guess what we're talking about when we're using cognitive behaviour therapy is to try and develop some skills in order to be able to reduce, or in some cases eliminate, unpleasant emotions that serve no purpose, emotions that are not adaptive or not helpful to enable us to get the things that we want. So first of all, just a few basic principles of cognitive behaviour therapy. And the first one is that cognitions, which are basically thoughts and beliefs, are the most important determinants of human emotion. Now, sometimes we have biological reasons why people might feel sad or depressed. So mood can sometimes be influenced by biology. But overall, the way that we think, our perceptions, are the most important determinants of human emotion. Events and people do not in themselves make us feel good or bad. They often provide a trigger, but the meaning that we give to those situations will be largely determined by our own perceptions. And one of the interesting things is, many years ago, I used to run groups at the North Shore Hospital for women with metastatic breast cancer. So these were all women who had advanced breast cancer and were aware of their prognosis, which generally was not good. What actually surprised me was the range of responses. And I had imagined that every one of those women would be really depressed. Before I started working, I just assumed, this would be a very depressing job. It wasn't. And in fact, people had a whole range of different responses. Amazingly, we adapt. And most people adapt well, even to the idea of their own mortality or their own, the fact that they have a terminal illness. Interestingly also, the women who did respond with intense anxiety or with major depression for a longer period of time were usually the ones that already had a history of anxiety and depression. So the way that we come to respond to situations, even bad situations, partly depends on the way that we think and the thinking habits that we've also already developed. In some cases, biology also plays a role, and if I get a chance, I'll mention that. The way that we think is shaped by our biology and our past experiences. So there are two things that determine personality. One is temperament, and temperament is the biological part of our personality. The second thing is life experiences. And the things that happen in our lives, especially in our early lives, have an effect in moulding the way that we think about the world and the way that we habitually behave. So personality is shaped by those two things. Even though we normally talk about early life experiences as being the most important, subsequent life experiences, experiences in adolescence, bullying in adolescence, those sorts of factors can also shape personality and shape the way we respond to all sorts of situations. Our thoughts are automatic and feel like truth. So when we think about things, we are usually not aware that we are thinking. We just perceive things as we believe they are and assume that what we are seeing is truth. But in fact, it's never totally objective truth. Our thoughts are always filtered by our own perceptions. And even the idea that we are thinking is something that we are usually not aware of. And in fact, one of the most useful things that we can learn, particularly when we're finding ourselves in upsetting or distressing situations, is to actually stop and recognise, I am having this thought right now. Isn't it interesting what my mind is doing? Look at how I'm responding to this situation. Something we rarely do. Our thoughts and beliefs can be changed, and some thoughts and beliefs can be changed in a really significant and major way. In some cases, some of our core beliefs may not be able to be changed, but can at least be modified or can be made a little bit more flexible. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is cognitive flexibility, the ability to just be a little bit more flexible with the way we perceive our situations. And developing cognitive flexibility enables us to reduce the frequency and the intensity of upsetting situations or distressing situations. Can I see a show of hands if you know someone who you would say is a really flexible thinker? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, and if you think of someone who's a really flexible thinker, How would you say that affects them? What are the consequences of being a flexible thinker? Anyone like to say?
What are the circumstances that feels like they've always got an option or options for consideration? So getting stuck doesn't seem to be part of the habitual way that they are.
Okay, so I'll just repeat that. So it seems like they always have an extra option. So even when situations are difficult, because they've got the option of being flexible, it means they can avoid upsetting situations or upsetting themselves excessively. Sometimes, of course, it's normal to be upset when things go wrong in our lives. It's normal to be upset for a period of time. But having cognitive flexibility gives us the option, or gives us the ability to be able to avoid getting upset excessively, and also enables us to bounce back relatively quickly. So the ABCD model is a model that was introduced by one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, and that's Dr. Ellis, recently, or died a few years ago, and he talked about the triggers and the underlying beliefs that contribute to it. And according to his model, we have A, which is the activating event or the trigger that upsets us. B stands for beliefs. C stands for consequences, and D stands for disputing. And disputing is the actual challenging some of the thinking that creates distress. And I'm going to use this model as to demonstrate an example. And in this particular example, let us say the activating event is that you go to a social function and you don't connect well in that situation. My guess is that probably all of us have experienced that, and probably on more than one occasion. You go along to an event and you kind of don't really have much anyone to talk to, and you're a little bit awkward. And let's jump straight to the consequences. And let's say in this situation you kind of feel a bit anxious, and then you leave and you feel a bit sad or a bit despondent in that situation. My question is it possible to go to a social function, not connect very well to anybody, and not feel sad about it? Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. So if you do feel really upset about it, there's probably some beliefs or some thinking or some assumptions that you're making that are contributing to the distress. So let's have a look at the B's now, and B standing for beliefs, but really incorporates thoughts as well. And let's say the thoughts in this situation might be something: I didn't fit in, I look stupid, they might think badly of me, they might think I've got no friends or something, you know, what are they thinking of me? And so on a conscious thought level, they may be some of the thoughts, but underlying that, we often have beliefs or assumptions which are not conscious, but still contribute to upsetting emotions. And in this example, perhaps some of the beliefs are: I should always connect well in every social situation. So if you have an expectation that that should always be the case, you are more likely to feel upset when that doesn't happen. Perhaps you also have an assumption that people judge me harshly, or people are looking and likely to be judging me harshly or thinking badly of me. The other belief that many of us have when things go wrong is that negative events have permanent consequences. And it's interesting when you look at the number of unpleasant or distressing or upsetting events that you've experienced during the course of your life, the vast majority do not have permanent or long-term consequences. There may be some that do, but in the total scheme of things, they would only be a very small percentage of the things that we get upset about. And yet, when something like that happens, we often, because of the effect of the emotions themselves, remember, emotions distort our thinking. They create a cognitive bias, they change the way that we think, and we tend to then almost feel like this is permanent. You know, this feeling of upsetness or distress is permanent. Most negative events don't have long-term consequences. Nevertheless, I'll come back to problem solving. So when we want to, so you're feeling upset in that situation, you're having the negative thoughts. Let's see the final stage of the ABCD model, and that's dispute. And we use the word dispute because, you know, we've got the A, B, C, and D. And here are some examples of things that you could actually say to yourself to challenge the automatic thoughts. So you might say, I prefer to engage well with people, but it's not going to happen in every situation. This is kind of a normal thing that everybody experiences in social situations. I connect well in some social situations and not others. You might also say, if you're a bit like me, you might say, I actually connect well in small groups or one-to-one. I'm not that comfortable with large social situations. And that in itself is also not going to make you feel terrible about yourself. That may just be something you accept. It's part of your personality. You might also remind yourself that most people don't notice and don't care. It's not like anyone's staring at you in that situation. I think it might have been on Oprah Winfrey that somebody said you would care very little about what people think about you if you realise how rarely they do. We're not that important. Most people often don't notice. And most people have been in similar situations themselves, etc. You might also remind yourself that, look, this is not going to have long-term consequences. Will this matter in 5 years' time? Will this matter in a few days' time, etc. In some cases, and I think people will say, that's fine to dispute like that if it's kind of a one-off or it happens from time to time. If this is an issue that is a problem for you that happens a lot, beyond just disputing or challenging your thoughts, it may also be useful to start thinking about problem solving. Okay, so if this is something, I feel really awkward in large situations, maybe I need to do some, what we would say in CBT, some graded exposure, and that means starting with very low threat situations and just practicing engaging in social situations in low threat situations, joining some groups on Meetup, for example, or getting out a little bit more and gradually building up social confidence. Sometimes in some situations even getting a bit of assistance might be useful. So one of the things I always say to people is it's not always about changing your thinking. Sometimes we have problems that can possibly either be solved or modified in some way. So always ask yourself the question, what can I do about it? Is this within my control? Can I change it? And some situations we do have a degree of control, or we can at least try and implement some control. But sometimes unwanted events happen and there's nothing we can do about it. And if you think about the things that happen in our lives, that's actually quite a common thing. Things happen and we can't do anything about it, we can't fix it. And if that's the case, if we can't change it, we have two options. One is to adapt and to modify our thinking, and the other option is to suffer. And so there are real advantages in being able to change the way that we think in those situations so that we can avoid unnecessary distress. And in order to do that, we need to develop cognitive flexibility. And that's the ability to adapt to situations. So when we're looking at cognitive flexibility, the first thing we need to recognise is that most of us have some very rigid rules that we're not even aware that we have, but those rigid rules influence the way that we react in all sorts of situations. Sometimes they've been referred to as the tyranny of the shoulds. Who's heard of the tyranny of the shoulds? Okay, just a few of you. Okay, so these are kind of assumptions and rules that we make about ourselves and the world. And the more rigidly we hold on to those rules, the more likely we are to become distressed when situations arise that don't meet our rules. So here are there's a whole lot of rules, there's hundreds of them, I just picked a bunch of them. So I should be liked and respected by everyone is probably the one that creates more distress and more anxiety than any others. The need for everyone to like us, a very common need for approval. I should always do things perfectly. Have we got any perfectionists in this room? Can I see perfectionists? Hands up. Okay, and having high standards is certainly appropriate and healthy, and we normally really encourage that. There is a difference between perfectionism and having high standards, and perfectionism generally tends to be maladaptive or unhelpful, unless you are a surgeon. If there are any surgeons, I hope you are a perfectionist. And there are certainly areas in our lives where perfectionism really is very important. But for many of us, perfectionism becomes maladaptive if it really goes against our basic goals, the things that are really important in our lives, and sometimes perfectionism can have very negative consequences. I should always be in control, and that often is an assumption for those of us who are anxious. Anxiety tends to generate a need for control because it makes, being in control makes us feel that our world becomes safe. By the way, I can see some of you taking photos and writing notes. I'm happy to send the slides to Carolyn, and you're quite welcome to distribute them to everyone here. So if you want to get the slides, it'll save you doing that. I should always be calm and relaxed. I should always be able to be available to others. Can I see a show of hands if you can relate to that? People in the helping professions in particular tend to really suffer from that. And look, with all of these beliefs, they are totally okay if there is some degree of cognitive flexibility. I think it's fine to say, I want to be helpful to others. It's fine to say, I like to be calm and relaxed. I prefer to be calm and relaxed. It's fine to say, I like people to like me, or I want people to like me. It's the absolutism with which we hold those beliefs that creates emotional distress. I should be outgoing and sociable. Who can relate to that? This sort of need that, this is something that we should be. And that we kind of, because through the media we're exposed more to people who are extroverted. For those 40% of us who are not in that sort of extroverted sort of area, you kind of feel like, maybe there's something wrong with me. I should have lots of friends. I should be able to foresee all possible problems and prevent them from happening. How do you respond when something happens that you hadn't anticipated? And how many of you have kind of been saying, I shouldn't have done that, I should have done this, I should have done that? Who can relate to that? And the reality is we are always operating with limited knowledge and awareness. And we will always make mistakes because we cannot foresee all possible problems and prevent them from happening. I should never make mistakes. I should always use my time productively. Who can relate to that? What are the consequences of believing that you should always use your time productively? Yeah, you get no downtime. And all of these beliefs have both behavioural consequences and emotional consequences. So the emotional consequence is guilt, and the behavioural consequence is that you're very hard on yourself and perhaps you don't allow yourself downtime. I should always be able to solve my own problems. In other words, I should never ask for help. It should be always up to me. I should be slim, youthful and attractive. And can you see that a lot of these beliefs are culturally influenced? We are very influenced, and now with social media on top of other forms of media, we develop all sorts of assumptions about how we should be, and all of these, if taken really rigidly, have the potential to create distress and misery in our lives. I should have a high status, well-paid job. I should be married or in a committed relationship. And you can see how if you have this belief and you don't fit into that situation, it creates all sorts of emotional distress. I should be doing and achieving more than I am. Can I see a show of hands who can relate to that? Yeah. Okay. And the question you've got to ask yourself is that a reasonable thing? And people often fear releasing those sort of beliefs because they worry that suddenly they'll become slack and not care anymore. I should be a perfect parent. Who can relate to that? Okay, and you can see the consequences. Guilt. I should always be positive and cheerful. I should be smarter than I am. And then we have all sorts of rules about the world and other people. And the world should be fair, and I should be always treated fairly. Who can relate to that? Okay. What is the problem with that belief? It's just not realistic. And I think it's fine to be able to say, I wish the world was fair, and I'm going to do everything I can to be fair and reasonable, trying to see justice. But at times we do need to recognise and accept that the world's not fair. Things should always go smoothly in my life. We don't normally walk around thinking that. But how do you respond when things don't go smoothly, when things go wrong? And often we end up with two problems. One is the computer that crashed, or the flat tire, or whatever it is that went wrong. And the other problem is the distress, the anger, the frustration, and the emotional distress that comes from the belief that it must not be so, or that it shouldn't happen. And very often we add extra problems by the way we emotionally respond to some of the actual logistical problems that happen in our lives. There is a right and wrong in every situation. We often sort of tend to assume that things are right and wrong. and others should share my opinions and values and do what I believe is right. And we don't consciously walk around saying that, but how do you respond? And how do you think about a person who expresses different values or does things differently? And isn't it easy to get annoyed or to judge that person? And interestingly, to kind of write off the whole person as a bad person, rather than recognising that, you know, we all come from, we have different histories, different biologies, different backgrounds, and we're all going to be, you know, think differently. I'll come back to this issue shortly. So I guess the point that I've been making is it's all about cognitive flexibility. It's about learning to modify our beliefs. You don't have to totally give up the things that you believe are important or the things that you believe in, not at all. But what CBT is about is learning to be flexible. I'm just going to give you a few examples of cognitive flexibility, taking some of those beliefs. And one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, what's a more healthy, balanced view? What's another way of thinking in this situation? Or how else can I think about this? And when do you ask yourself that question, or when can you ask yourself that question? Well, the best time is when you notice that you are becoming upset about something. So when you find yourself feeling some sort of distress, stop and ask yourself, you know, how else can I think about this? So here are some of the beliefs that we just looked at. First of all, in the rigid form, and then in the more flexible form. I should be 100% competent in every area. And a dispute might be on, I am competent in some areas and not in others. I'm happy to work on improving my skills that matter, but it is unrealistic to expect that I can be competent in every area. Okay, can you see that there's some flexibility there in the thinking? People should always do the right thing. A dispute might be, people have different values and beliefs to mine and will sometimes say or do things that I don't like. I wish everyone shared my values and always did what I believe is right, but it's inconsistent with the world that we live in. So just recognising that people think differently, behave differently to us. Things should be fair and I should always be treated fairly. The dispute might be the world is full of injustice, lots of things are unfair and most people experience injustice at times. I don't like it, but if I can't change it, I can learn to accept it. This one tends to create a lot of resistance. And I'm going to come back to this belief because a lot of people say, yeah, but I don't want to accept it. And my question is always, can you change it? Is there something you can do? And if there's not anything you can do, you know, perhaps accepting that there are some things in life that just are not fair is the most psychologically healthy way to think. Things should always go smoothly in my life. You might challenge with, it's nice when things go well for me, much of the time they do, but there's no reason why things must always go smoothly. Hassles are a normal and unavoidable part of life. There's a right and wrong in every situation. We recognise that most complex situations are not black and white, but have shades of grey. And often there is no right or wrong, and various perspectives may be valid. Should be able to foresee all possible problems and prevent them from happening. And we recognise that in hindsight we can always see things more rationally, but we're always acting with limited information, and they can't always prevent all bad things from happening. So you get the gist of these sorts of beliefs. We think about the assumptions that we make, and we start to just impose a little bit of cognitive flexibility. If you were able to do this, or if you started to change your assumptions, to change them from absolute rigid assumptions to some degree of flexibility, how would that affect the way that you feel? Would that affect the way that you feel? And perhaps it would just mean that you don't get hassled, annoyed, angry, frustrated, distressed to the same degree, or or even if you do feel frustrated in the short term, that you're able to recognise that there's other ways of thinking about it, and that you don't have to upset yourself in a lot of situations. So when we're looking at disputing or challenging our thinking, there are a number of just very simple questions we can ask ourselves, and some of those questions might be, what's an alternative, more balanced view? What would I tell a friend who was in my situation? Why is that a really good question? Okay, what would I tell a friend if it wasn't about me, if it was about somebody else? What advice would I give to this person?
It takes the emotion.
Pardon?
It takes
It takes the emotion out of it. And in fact, remember, it's the emotion that gives you that sort of cognitive distortion. You take the emotion out of it and you say, it's not about me, it's about a friend. And we can often see a much more reasonable and balanced view when we're thinking about somebody else or when we're advising someone else. So that's actually often a good question to ask yourself. Or alternatively, think about somebody who you think of as a really positive, flexible person. And then ask yourself the question, how would they respond? If they were in my situation, how would they respond to this situation? What can I learn from the experience? And one of the things that we always remind people is even when life is really difficult or upsetting and circumstances are very trying, there are always things that we can learn from those situations. And recognising that there are lessons that we can learn is also a useful process. What am I grateful for? In spite of negative events in our lives, there is always something that we can still be grateful for. So think about that. Is this within my control? Can I change it? And finally, am I being flexible? Now, this is a thought, and there are other ways to think about this. So just recognising that I'm feeling the way that I do because this is a thought. One of the things when I teach a program in Sydney Uni called Change Your Thinking, one of the things that we do in the first session is get people to, during the week, to record the triggers, what were the triggers, and what were my thoughts, how did I think about it. And before we even start disputing, people will come back week 2 and say, you know what, those things really just didn't upset me the way they normally would have. We haven't even learned how to dispute. And people are saying the very fact that I'm aware that this is a thought and I'm having this thought means I can sort of step back from it. It creates a certain distance to my thought. So just being aware that we are thinking is a really important and useful part of the process. As I said a little earlier, there are times when we need to explore problem solving. And sometimes we need to take action and try and resolve a problem, an injustice or an issue that we're concerned about. But I always remind people, don't waste your energy on things that are beyond your control. There are some things you can change, there are some things you can't. And your job is to work out which is which. And make it a life philosophy to not waste your energy on things that are beyond your control. Also, don't waste your energy on things that don't matter in the long term. We often spend a lot of our emotional energy on small stuff. And in the end, it's just not that important. Start to recognise this is not important. A good question to ask yourself, will this matter in 5 years' time? You know, if you want to separate the small stuff from the important issues. And finally, don't waste your energy on things that don't justify the energy. Things that don't justify the energy risk required to pursue them. So sometimes, you know, we get really caught up in an issue and we, you know, we sort of get more and more involved, and then we, you know, need to fight and we need to take some action. And I've seen people sort of spiral into bigger and bigger depressions trying to you know, sometimes it's just easier to say, you know what, I'm just going to walk away from this because I just don't want to spend the emotional energy on this. Can I see a show of hands if you've had that experience, that you've actually decided to walk away? And sometimes that is the most healthy experience. So I often remind people, is this really worth it? Because for some issues, the cost of pursuing it may be greater than ultimately the potential benefits. And sometimes the most healthy response is just learning to accept that this is how it is. And over the years, there have been different ways of expressing acceptance. And one way is the serenity prayer that I'm sure most of us have heard of. God, give me the serenity to accept the things that I can't change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that's one way of conceptualising acceptance. When I was working at the Royal North Shore Hospital, one of the women in the groups came up with this acceptance affirmation. And this was about accepting the stuff that happened in her own life. And this is how it is, not how it was or might have been or should have been, not how I wanted it to be, hoped it would be, planned it would be. I accept that this is how it is, and now I get on with my life in a positive way. And that is also another way of conceptualising acceptance. say, this is how it is, and now I get on to my life in a positive way. One of my clients actually said something interesting. We were talking about acceptance, and I actually really like this. And he said, for me, acceptance is, it's like the weather. And when you think about it, if today happened to be a really squally, cold, miserable day with wind and rain, we would not be ruminating about this. We would not, and let's say the Bureau forecast a week of weather like this. We would not be ruminating and say, that's terrible, why is this happening, it shouldn't be, why, we don't do that, because we kind of accept weather is weather. There's absolutely nothing we can do about it, so we just get on with it, and if we have to go outside, we take our umbrellas and our raincoats and whatever, but we accept that that's the weather. And he said, for me, that's what acceptance is. It's like the weather. It's being able to say, you know what, this is how it is, nothing I can do about it. And I really like that form of conceptualisation. It's really recognising that there's nothing we can do about it. It's interesting though, because quite often when we talk about acceptance, many of us find it really difficult to accept. And in fact, even when we look at psychological therapy, one of the real roadblocks in psychological therapy is resistance. We call that resistance. It's like this part of us that doesn't want to completely let go of emotional pain, or doesn't want to let go of the way that we think about things. And I want to do a little exercise to see, maybe some of you can also relate to that. So I'm going to ask you to think about something that is an unhappy event in your life, something that you don't like in your life. You don't need to share it with anyone. This is just for you. Something that you wish was different, but which you cannot control or change. So it needs to be something that you really do need to accept because you cannot change it. And I'm going to invite you just for a minute to close your eyes and to imagine that you have totally accepted the reality of this situation. And imagine yourself perhaps hovering around the house or doing things at home that you normally do, but this issue and this event in your life that you cannot change, it's still there, it's still a reality in your life. But the resistance is gone. You totally accept that this is part of your life. It is a reality. And the resistance is gone. And when you feel ready, open your eyes. Okay, and whenever we do this exercise, people have different responses. And some people will say, oh yes, no, I really like the idea of just accepting it. But some people will kind of feel some resistance. And some of you might have felt like, not totally comfortable with this. Can I see a show of hands if you didn't feel comfortable with completely letting this go? Okay, quite often we get quite a few. Would anyone be prepared to give me your yes, but you don't have to necessarily tell us the situation, but just what was your resistance about? What was kind of stopping you from letting this go completely? Anyone want to? Pardon? Sorry?
It made me sad.
So the idea of accepting it makes you more sad?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and my guess is it makes you sad because when you accept it, you're saying, I give up, there's nothing more I can do, I recognise that there's nothing I can do. Anyone else relate to that? That when you accept it, you're saying, well, that means I give up. And my question is, whether or not you give up, the outcome's probably the same. Would that be true? If you've chosen something that genuinely you can't do anything about. It's interesting, isn't it, that we, on a kind of primitive level or a gut level, often want to hold on to things because it feels like holding on to the pain is somehow doing something or prepares you to do something, or maybe it feels like you still have some sort of control. and releasing it and actually saying this is part of my life makes you feel like, well, now I'll never be able to change it. We confuse holding on in an emotionally painful way with somehow controlling or changing the situation. And this is actually a common response when we come to resistance. People are often reluctant to let go of upsetting situations and truly accept the reality of the situation, because at some level it feels like giving up means just allowing that problem to manifest forever. You could relate to that. Some of you could relate to it. So sometimes we need to challenge that belief and the belief that acceptance will somehow make the issue permanent. It's permanent anyway. If it's really something you can't control, it's permanent anyway. And so one of the things that we sometimes find really useful is to actually imagine what our lives would be like if we could truly accept that and move on and not hold back onto our pain. So dealing with resistance is an interesting issue. Sometimes we want to hold on to painful emotions. One of the questions I always invite people to ask is my thinking adaptive? Is it helping me to get the things that I want? Does thinking or behaving this way help me to achieve my goals? And I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, even though I'm thinking of one particular client, we all I guess have come across people like this who tend to be very angry and annoyed by lots of things, and angry Annie carries her anger a lot of the time. And she says, I can't stand Betty, this is a work colleague, and she says, and I treat her accordingly. And why should I change the way that I think? Because really it's, I've got all these, these people that are hopeless people. Why should it be me who changes my thinking? And one of the questions I ask Angry Annie is, does thinking or behaving this way help you to achieve your goals? What are your goals? And we can ask ourselves the questions, we can all ask ourselves the questions in our own lives. And here are Annie's goals. So Annie wants to be productive and effective in her work, because this is a workplace issue. She can't stand someone at work. She said, I want to get ahead in my career. I want to be respected by my colleagues. I want to enjoy my job. I want to get on with people. I want to sleep well. I want to feel relaxed and happy. So they're her goals, and they're kind of probably very common goals that most of us can relate to some extent. And if they are your goals, then ask yourself the question, does doing what you're doing help you to feel good and help you to achieve those goals? Just before we sum up, it's interesting. I play bridge, and bridge is a really interesting, if you play duplicate in the club, it's a really interesting insight into different people's personality, because bridge is mildly stressful, and you really see some people that are aggressive or that are defensive or that are very insecure. And there's one woman there who is really very self-focused. She's often rude. She takes forever, so bridge relies on everybody moving tables at the same time, but she's forever sort of taking extra minutes and sitting there analysing her hands. And it's interesting that, my instinctive reaction to her is kind of like, this annoyance and sort of, and afterwards sort of almost having fantasies about, I'm going to tell her off and I'm going to tell her what, and tell her that she should get her act together. And then sort of stopping and even thinking about that and thinking about, so I can actually get really involved in the content, or I can step back and say, this is a person with a personality problem. And that is the reality. And many of the people that we waste our energy on, that we ruminate about and that we get really angry and waste a whole lot of energy, are people who are struggling with their own personality issues. And, I think we've mentioned before that 50% of the population will have mental health problems at some stage. There are a lot of people who have ongoing personality issues which make them difficult to get on with, that make them really hard to manage if you have to see them on a regular basis or work with them. But actually having some insight and being able to step back and observe a behaviour without automatically going to that automatic pilot is actually quite a useful thing to do. So I must say, after I found myself having these thoughts, I actually stepped back and I thought, no, this woman really does have some personality issues, and I'm going to observe it. Now, that doesn't mean that you should never say something, and I think I will say something when a behaviour is obviously very antisocial in some situations, but sometimes just observing it and not buying into it, not getting personally caught up in it, is actually the most adaptive and helpful thing to do. Remembering that our own goals are usually also about being happy, being relaxed, being able to sleep well, being able to get on with people, and not distressing ourselves unnecessarily if we can possibly avoid it. So to sum up what I've talked about today, first of all, upsetting emotions are largely created by thoughts and by our perceptions. We can reduce unnecessary distress by being more aware of our thoughts and developing some cognitive flexibility. Start thinking about your thinking. And when you find yourself feeling angry, anxious, frustrated, or upset in any way, stop and ask yourself, what thoughts are going through my mind right now? What am I telling myself right now? How am I thinking about this? And you might also ask yourself the question, what's a more healthy, balanced view? Or if I was one of my positive friends who was really positive and adaptive, how would they be thinking in this situation? The very fact that you start thinking about your thinking and looking for alternatives will help you to take a step back and feel less distressed. Sometimes we resist changing our thoughts because upsetting emotions feel protective. And at times we hold on to worry, or sometimes we hold on to anxiety, sometimes we hold on to anger. And sometimes we want to hold on to guilt. Sometimes we want to keep punishing ourselves for all sorts of different reasons. And sometimes it's useful to start understanding some of those processes. And when we notice that we're resistant to change, we can ask ourselves the question, does thinking or behaving this way help me to achieve my goals? I find that a really useful question. Is what I'm doing right now consistent with what's important to me, or is it actually self-defeating in terms of the things that are important to me? Thank you, everybody. That is a brain with all sorts of cogs there. Thank you, everybody. I hope that what I've said to you has given you some food for thought. And we've got a few minutes if you want to have questions.
So, questions?
Yep.
What about trauma memories and trauma that really, the attachment to that memory, the attachment to that feeling becomes really powerful, and so the investment in that feeling is quite strong.
Absolutely, and in fact when we're dealing with trauma, often it's not a matter of just using cognitive strategies like changing your thinking. Trauma hardwires fears and automatic responses, and what I've talked about today is kind of general stress management. When we're dealing with trauma, really we need more specific psychological therapy, and often actually revisiting the actual trauma itself. You're probably aware the most effective treatments for trauma are actually exposure and revisiting them. Sometimes is giving a new meaning to what happened. There's a whole range of techniques. So trauma is more complex, and I certainly would just be saying what's another way of thinking about it. Yeah. Anyone else like to ask a question?
Is there such a thing as being too flexible in your decision?
That is just ask that again if you like.
Is there such a thing as being too flexible in your thinking?
That is a really common fear. And the fear is, well, if I become, if I develop cognitive flexibility, maybe I'll be that laid back. I won't care about everything. Like, I'll be kind of cool about everything. Let me say that doesn't happen. And in fact, the challenge is always to get people to be a little bit more flexible. Being flexible doesn't mean you stop caring. Being flexible doesn't mean that you no longer have goals or things don't matter. What it does mean is when distressing events happen, that you can adapt your thinking so that you don't continue to suffer emotionally unnecessarily. In the short term, if upsetting things happen, you will probably feel the appropriate emotion. You will go through a period of feeling guilty or angry or anxious or frustrated. or resentful or whatever it is that you feel. Those sort of emotions are normal and sometimes adaptive. It's where you go with those emotions. And if you continue to feel those emotions, in most cases, they are not adaptive. They are not moving you towards your goals. They are not directing you into the direction that you would like. And in fact, they tend to have the opposite effect. But that's a good question because it always comes up, you know, if I become too flexible, I'll just kind of be that laid back, I'll kind of fall over. Thank you.
Have you got any tips or tricks for teaching this to our adolescent children?
I actually think the trick is to become very aware of it yourself, to actually understand and to be conscious of how this process works, and then to model it in the way that you treat your kids, and to sometimes talk to them about. A lot of the concepts of CBT are very basic and not that hard to communicate. Just the very idea, first of all, that upsetting emotions pass. When we feel upset, it feels like it's permanent and forever and things will never change. But upsetting emotions pass. So even actually explaining that to your kids, and it's normal to feel upset at times. And also explaining to your kids that sometimes we make ourselves upset because the way that we think about those things. Just demonstrating other ways. So if you as a parent come up with a more adaptive, balanced view when your child is upset about something, what you're actually doing is gradually teaching them how to think in a more adaptive way. I know that in some schools, they had a program called Mind Matters where they actually started introducing cognitive behaviour therapy within the school curriculum, but my understanding is it's very small and it's not widely taught, but it should be. Any other questions? Well, I'll be around for morning tea, so if anyone prefers to just ask me privately, please, you're perfectly welcome to come and see me.